Okay, we live? Maska Gro, everybody. Nubians and lovers of Nubia. I Arbaab Inna. My name is Arbaab. Real name Hatim, but I go by Arbaab, and I'm a Nubian type designer. So أول شيء بس كنت داير أقول المتابعين اللي بيفهموا اللغة العربية أو ما بيفهموا اللغة الإنجليزية اسمه شنو؟ يا ريت قدرنا نجيب مترجم يترجم المحاضرة دي باللغة العربية، بس للأسف ما قدرنا. بس في المستقبل نحن حننزل الفيديو ده على قناة نوبيا فيست على اليوتيوب، وحنخط عليه ترجمة عربية مكتوبة. بس الليلة بس المحاضرة حتكون باللغة الإنجليزية، بس إن شاء الله في المستقبل أنتوا حتقدروا تشاهدوا وتفهموا كل اللي داير أقوله عن الخط النوبي والخط النوبي الرقمي على الكمبيوترات. But for now, it's great to see all of you. So last year, Vincent gave a talk on the then current state of Nubian type design, which in brief wasn't exactly a thing. We had a handful of Coptic fonts that were being used to write Nubian, but there weren't any typefaces that specifically drew from the old Nubian manuscript tradition, most notably what Vincent and Joel dubbed traditional bookhand. Basically the slanted majuscule that we find in the majority of old Nubian texts, like the Sarah East Codex, which is what I have as the background here. Vincent made a call to essentially start Nubian type design from the beginning. Go back to the source of Nubian writing, the old Nubian written culture, and use that as the basis of a new font that meets the needs of the Nubian language speakers, as well as the Nubiological community, all while being accurate to old Nubian's unique aesthetic qualities, as well as just being generally, nice to look at, easy to read, and compatible with the latest software. I'm happy to say that in just the past year alone, considerable progress has been made in the field of Nubian type design, and with it, there are new challenges. There is now finally a publicly available font that does draw from the Nubian manuscript tradition, my font, Sawarda, which I've used for the title here, which I designed largely in response to Vincent and Joel's lecture last year. The font is still under development, but you can find an alpha version of it on the Union for Nubian Studies website. So I think the introduction of Sawarda changes things in the field considerably, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Some of these challenges, Sawarda will hopefully meet eventually, but other things are going to have to be handled by other type designers. And that's basically what I want to talk about today, where Nubian type design is now and where, in my opinion, it needs to go. So let's start by looking at the current state of the field. What options do we currently have when it comes to writing Nubian? And do they meet what, at least I personally believe, should be the goals of Nubian type design? So last year, Vincent made a list of features that Nubian typefaces should meet, and I think it really works really well as a framework for assessing Nubian typefaces. So basically, the criteria are the font should be available in up-to-date typeface formats, things like the OTF format or the WAF format, which is especially important for the web. It should accommodate the character sets of both ancient and modern Nubian texts. It should be licensed under an open font license. I understand that some people may not see this as essential. I do. I think that for an endangered script, it's really important that the fonts in this field be open, and so having an open font license is a part of that. It should include the diacritics and symbols that are needed for scholarly writing, and it should be based on the ductus of old Nubian texts. I would only make one adjustment to Vincent's criteria from last year, which is that I think it should also have harmonious and Latin and Arabic components. I'll talk about why later, but to put it quickly, Latin and Arabic are usually used alongside Nubian. Nubian is rarely presented in a monolingual context. And as a result, I would say a great Nubian typeface is one that makes it easy for someone to juxtapose Nubian and the Latin script and the Arabic script. So with that started, let's go over and look at Aegyptus. This is probably the rarest of the Nubian fonts. Up until now, I've only seen it as the default font on Linux and really nowhere else. In terms of the criteria we laid out for a Nubian font, Aegyptus is technically behind. It's a TrueType font, and as far as I can tell, it isn't available in more up-to-date formats. It does have all the letters you'd need for both ancient and modern Nubian texts. It's under an open font license, which is nice. It is, however, lacking when it comes to diacritics and symbols that you need for scholarly editions. It's also a font designed for Egyptologists, so it uses Coptic letter form. That's great for Coptic, but as a Nubian font, it doesn't build on the Nubian manuscript tradition, which is kind of a theme with the fonts we're going to be talking about today. As far as harmonizing with Latin and Arabic, there are some papyrus-style capitals and small caps, but there's nothing really extensive in terms of making a harmonious Latin and Nubian component. The next font is Antinuo, I believe that's how it's said. It continues to be the most widely used Nubian font in sort of scholarly contexts. From a technical standpoint, it's a TrueType font that hasn't been updated in the last 9 years, so it's already somewhat outdated and likely to stay that way. It is, however, fully outfitted with the letters you need to write modern and ancient Nubian. It's an open source font, which is great. It has the diacritics and symbols that scholars need, which is also great. It is the standard in a lot of publications, so this is kind of expected. Unfortunately, it's also based on Coptic letter form. This works great for Coptic texts, which is what Antinuo is built for, but in terms of Nubian written texts, it doesn't really resemble any historical examples of the Nubian script. It also doesn't have a truly harmonious Latin and/or Arabic counterpart. Next, we have Sophia Nubian. This is the archetypal modern Nubian font. It was developed by the SIL specifically for Nubian language speakers, and it's still the Nubian font you'll find the most in print and on merchandise, and in a lot of newer learning materials, like the Nubi app or Nuban Khalil's most recent Nubian textbook. It's a TrueType font that hasn't been updated since 2008, so like Antinuo, it's kind of obsolete. It was specifically designed for Nubian, so it does have all the letters you'll need for Nubian. It has an open font license, which is great. It's really lacking in the diacritics and symbols that scholars need. It's also a heavily Latinized Coptic font rather than a proper Nubian font. Despite the fact that this is the Nubian font most people encounter first, including myself, its design draws more from Coptic and honestly fonts like Arial than any actual Nubian manuscripts. It has a Latin font built into it that harmonizes well with its specific brand of Latinized Coptic, but there's no Arabic component. The next font we have is Nodo Sans, which I think is becoming more and more popular. If you use social media, especially Twitter, this is usually the Nubian font you'll find because it's pre-installed with Google Chrome. The Andandi Matoki keyboard, so the Dongolawi Nubian keyboard that Samsung's Android phones now ship with, they also use Nodo Sans. So, like all of Google's Nodo fonts, it's available in a variety of formats, which is great for web. It's really recent and really up to date. So from a technical standpoint, Nodo Sans is doing pretty good. It's got all the letters you need for modern Nubian writing. It's under an open font license. It's still pretty lacking in terms of diacritics, symbols, ligatures that scholars might need, though. It's also another heavily Latinized Coptic font. Just speaking like personally, I think aesthetically it looks better and cleaner than Sophia, but at the same time it has about as much resemblance to old Nubian texts as Sophia does, which is to say, not very much. Thankfully, since it is a part of Google's Nodo project, which is supposed to include basically every language on the face of the earth, it has a robust Latin and Arabic component, both of which it matches with, pretty gracefully. Then, last but not least, we have my font, which was designed specifically to meet the goals that we talked about earlier. So that is Sawarda. It's an OpenType font, but is also available in TrueType and WAF formats, and in the most recent versions of these formats. So from a technical standpoint, it's doing better than a lot of these other fonts. It has all the letters you need for ancient and modern Nubian texts. It's under an open font license. It is also outfitted with a monstrous number of diacritics and brackets and ligatures. So hypothetically, it should work really well for scholarly use. Vincent, the old Nubian scholar, has kind of taken it for a test drive, and I think so far it's holding up pretty well. it is actively based on Old Nubian manuscripts, primarily one of the texts from Qasr Ibrahim. So that means that overall Sawarda leans pretty conservative in terms of letter form, almost to a fault, but that makes it the only font that we've talked about today that tries to mimic Old Nubian aesthetics, and I think it does it pretty successfully. The version of Sawarda that is currently available doesn't have a Latin or Arabic component. Sawarda is technically built on top of Nodo Sans, so if you try typing some English in it right now, you'll get a heavily broken Nodo Sans, and there are also no Arabic characters, but as you can kind of see in this presentation, I'm starting to work on a Latin component for Sawarda, and down the line I plan on having a harmonious Arabic component as well. But for now, if you're using the public version of Sawarda, you have to do your own type matching, which is an issue. So Sawarda is still a work in progress. Even the version I'm working with now and using in the books for Gerifai Omir is already miles ahead of what has been publicly released. That said, I really do think its design philosophy can provide something of a blueprint to future Nubian type designers. So the most important thing that Sawarda does, in my opinion, is actually imitate the aesthetics of Old Nubian. So it really leans towards this kind of like handwritten style that we find in Old Nubian manuscripts, as opposed to going with something like a Coptic manuscript with some Copticized Nubian letters or a Latinized form of Coptic. I find usually when describing the difference between Nubian and Coptic, the slant is what people focus on, and it is an iconic feature of Nubian, but I do warn against looking at Nubian as essentially slanted Coptic. With Sawarda, rather than design every letter and then tilt them the 20 degrees necessary to resemble the slant in the manuscripts, I designed every letter slanted from the beginning, which illustrates something important. Namely, the Nubian slant behaves differently on different letters. Letters like beta, gamma, iota, and ni, those are like clearly slanted based on like the counterparts we know of in, say, Coptic or Greek or English, but there are also some letters that like don't change between upright and slanted Nubian manuscripts. So here at the second bullet point, alpha, delta, zeta, upsilon, those remain the same, they don't tilt for the most part. There are also two letters which often slant left, those being omega and Shai. So instead of thinking of the Nubian script as being Coptic with a slant, we should think of slantedness in Nubian kind of the way we think of cursiveness in Arabic. Basically, it's an inherent property of the script rather than a modifier to the basic letter form. And I warn Nubian type designers against designing things upright only to slant them later, because I think, at least from personal experience, it's really obvious when the font has just been made oblique. If you're going to make a slanted Nubian typeface, I would personally recommend doing what Sawarda did and slanting it from the beginning. So the most important thing to replicate when designing a Nubian typeface. It's not so much about the immediately noticeable things like the slant, but rather subtleties in how different letters are written. So what this means is that you can have an upright Nubian font that's still recognizably Nubian based on how it approaches letters like the alpha, or the beta, or the lambda, or the zeta, or any of the other letters that I have listed here. These types of differences are replicable in modern type design, and they are, in my opinion, beautiful, and I hope Sawarda stands as an example of how the uniquely Nubian way of writing letters can exist in modern typefaces. That said, earlier I said Sawarda is conservative almost to a font and to like a fault, and that's kind of in the letter proportions. So this is something that varies a lot among Nubian manuscripts, but a lot of Nubian manuscripts like to have rather extreme ascenders and descenders, which is something I tried to hold to in the initial versions of Sawarda, but I found that when writing text with that, it created a lot of challenges, especially because a lot of the more common letters, like Ro and Shai, just have really crazy long descenders, and it kind of like screws with how you can write the text. So that's something I've just been like, cutting down on. It's something to definitely keep track of if you're designing a Nubian typeface. So The thing is, though, in my opinion, Nubian type design isn't just about being faithful to old Nubian aesthetics. It's important to think about the contexts in which Nubian writing appears today, which is primarily bilingual contexts alongside Latin and Arabic, be it in scholarly works where the Latin script is usually used, or learning materials where you see a lot of Arabic alongside Nubian, or even social media, since most people who write in Nubian kind of tend to expect that their audience isn't fully literate in it. So while at first I wasn't interested in adding Latin and Arabic to Sawarda, which I actually said in the release notes that you'll find for the first version of Sawarda, after talking about it with the Armenian type designer Hrant Papassian, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, I came to realize that not providing users with a Latin-Arabic option could lead them to decide against including the Nubian script in whatever they're writing. For instance, if they have Nubian, Latin, and Arabic on the poster, if the Nubian doesn't match the Latin and Arabic, it's conceivable that someone would choose to write the Nubian in one of the other two scripts, which people are more familiar with anyway, which is a problem. A good Nubian typeface should actually encourage people to use the Nubian alphabet instead of any other form of transliteration. And so it's kind of our job as Nubian type designers to make that both a great aesthetic decision and a very convenient thing to do. And I think making a harmonious Latin and Arabic is a part of that. So the question becomes, how do we develop Latin and Arabic fonts for Nubian? So far with Sawarda's Latin component, I call the approach Nubo-centric. Nubo-centric in that I design specifically for the needs of the Nubian and Nubiological communities, and then think of the needs of a more general Latin using audience. So what does this mean? It means that instead of sticking to just the basic 26 letters that English needs, or instead of filling out the entire Latin Unicode block, which is very big, I focus on all the letters that Nubians and Nubiologists have historically used when writing Nubian in the Latin script. For example, in this image here, we see that the circumflex is commonly used to indicate vowel length, the difference between a and a. So we see this in like Mutawalla Badr's learning textbook. So when I design Sawarda Latin, one of the big things I do is I include all the letters with a circumflex. Scholars also like to use the Spanish ñ or the Latin eng to represent the palatal and velar nasals, which are present in Nubian but not in English. And again, that's something I designed and added into Sawarda without necessarily filling out the rest of the Unicode block that they fall under, because that's the type of thing that the Nubians and the Nubiological community might need. So approaching things this way means that we can meet the needs of the audience of Nubian type design while not overburdening the designer with designing a bunch of obscure characters that the audience isn't going to need. This is for sure bad type design practice, but it's efficient and it's a good method of scale management in my eyes, especially if you're working with limited time, which I think most Nubian type designers kind of are. So when I eventually come around to designing Arabic, Nubocentricity is going to mean adding in letters from Persian, like the pe and the ke, as well as letters from Ajami or Kurdish or other Arabic scripts, which have some extra characters to represent sounds that Arabic doesn't inherently have, but Nubian has. But that's still kind of like down the line. Beyond the character set, though, the big challenge when making a Latin and Arabic component of Sawarda is figuring out what exactly it means to Nubianize Latin or Arabic. This is a question I still need to find the answer to, but surprisingly, the more I designed Sawarda Latin, the less extreme I became about Nubianizing the Latin. For instance, at first I tried adding a lot of hooks to letters, because hooks are a pretty common part of the Nubian script, but ultimately I took most of them out. Another thing is that like Latin fonts kind of like these really, perfect geometric shapes, whereas Nubian really doesn't. It prefers like an egg shape and things like the sigma and the omicron. So when I designed like the Latin C and the Latin O, I went for that more like egg shape that looks like it was written with multiple strokes, like, a Nubian sigma or a Nubian omicron would be, rather than going with a more sort of like traditional look. I also gave Sawarda Latin some sort of like wild and extravagant descenders, which again is a very key part of the Nubian aesthetic. So I also made the Latin inherently slanted, and I'm hopefully getting closer to having a Latin font that plays well with Sawarda Nubian. The thing is, though, is that Latin and Nubian are in many ways kind of similar scripts, being ultimately both Greek-based. There's going to be far more challenges in deciding what it takes to make Arabic look Nubian, which isn't an issue I've tackled yet. So, as an extension of the Nubiocentric philosophy I mentioned earlier, I think having a Nubian font that meets the needs of the Nubiological community is really important, especially because the Nubiological community needs some things that the Egyptological community, which Coptic fonts are designed for, just don't. One of those things is Nubian ligatures, which are pretty common in Nubian texts, but until Sawarda, they weren't available in other fonts. Things like the Gamma Iota or the Engma Iota or the Tau Iota, which I have in this image here, they're uniquely Nubian ligatures. At the same time, the Nubiological community needs certain Coptic characters that you don't need when you're writing modern Nubian. Things like the stigma, the psi, theta, xi, maybe even the yanya and the two different forms of the che, because they do sometimes appear in the Old Nubian corpus, at least rarely, or they're used for numerals. So even though they're not something that the primary audience for Sawarda Nubians need, it's definitely something I would recommend including. So while Sawarda isn't perfect, I'm at least hoping that down the line it will be able to accomplish all the goals that I mentioned earlier. That it'll have all the letters that Nubians and Nubiologists need in Nubian, Latin, and Arabic. It'll be free and open source. It'll be based on old Nubian documents. However, from a bigger picture standpoint, the field of Nubian type design is still badly in need of two types of fonts that Sawarda just isn't going to be. For lack of a better term, I think Nubian still needs a kind of like default font. While Sawarda is capable of being used in a scholarly setting or in infographics, it's fundamentally like a really artistic and stylized typeface because it was ultimately meant to be used alongside illustrations and in illustrated children's books. I'm confident that it'll work for those purposes, but my eventual vision is that when you write something Nubian in a program like Keyman, or see Nubian in a book, or even see it in social media, it will be with a properly Nubian font rather than a Latinized Coptic one. And Sawarda, because of its specific aesthetic qualities, can't really compete with the fonts that are currently dominating in the spheres, which are Sophia and Nodo. And that's because Sawarda is just like too flashy and kind of unwieldy. You know, the text weight is really heavy, the extenders are really eccentric. It's hopefully nice to look at, but not something you'd want to use on Facebook. I think there should be a Nubian font specifically designed to harmonize with Nodo Sans or Droid Arabic Naskh, which are increasingly the default fonts for Latin and Arabic on the web. We may also want something built to harmonize with Times New Roman or the other fonts that you tend to see in academic texts, which are written in the Latin and Arabic scripts. Overall, there just needs to be a more convenient Nubian font that's not flashy, but gets the job done without totally ignoring the roots of the script. And I do think that's possible. As a more minor note, while working on the Gerify Omir project, I desperately wish to have some options for Nubian display fonts. Again, Sawarda looks nice, but not so much in a display context. So I have a quasi-font that I use in this place, which I currently call Arbaab Mina, because it's based on the Miracle of St. Mina manuscript, which works better. You can see it here on the cover of the Miracle of Imam Rinas, but it also has a really, really specific aesthetic. I think that both the Nubian manuscript tradition as well as modern Nubian culture provide a lot of aesthetic options in the field of display fonts. I was recently contacted by a designer named Noura, who will hopefully be speaking with us this year, who designed a Nubian font with a team of Nubian henna artists, which draws from the modern Nubian henna aesthetic, and it's beautiful, and we definitely need more things like that. Sawarda isn't that, can't be that, but Nubian type design won't be complete until there is more of that. So I hope this is a gap that any future designers listening to are keeping in mind, especially because I've noticed more and more we see Nubian writing on things like t-shirts and stickers and jewelry. So there should definitely be fonts that are built for these uses rather than things like Sophia and Nodo, which really aren't. So that is, for the most part, where we're at with Nubian type design, as long as we just mean typefaces designed for the Nubian alphabet. But Nubians and the Nubiological community don't just work with the Nubian alphabet. Increasingly, there's another script that Nubia gave birth to that we're starting to see more and more, Meroitic, specifically the Meroitic cursive script, which is used in the overwhelming majority of Meroitic texts. Meroitic is becoming better understood, and there are more recent articles where Meroitic terms are being compared to Nubian terms, meaning that Nubians and Nubiologists are juxtaposing these two scripts kind of more and more. And I'm still only starting out on designing Meroitic, but there's something kind of odd I noticed, which is that even though Meroitic isn't used to write any modern language, there are ironically more fonts designed specifically for Meroitic than there are for Nubian. Unfortunately, they still have a lot of problems in my eyes. So we'll start with the RK fonts, or Reinhold Kienhofer fonts, and I think we should just apply the lens that we had earlier to the Meroitic fonts as well, with kind of one addition, which is that I think a good Meroitic typeface ideally also visually matches a Nubian typeface, in addition to Latin and Arabic, especially because Meroitic, in addition to being used alongside Latin and Arabic, is increasingly being used alongside Nubian. With that in mind, the RK font is probably the most accessible Nubian font. That said, it's still a TrueType font, not available in newer and more robust formats, and notably, it's not a Unicode font. The most easily accessible version of this font kind of works like wingdings for people who are familiar with it. Basically, it's a font for the Latin script that replaces Latin characters with Meroitic ones. I can see why this was done, considering a specific issue with Meroitic type design that I'll get to later, but it should be noted that this means right out of the box, you can't even write Meroitic right to left with this font, which is how the Meroitic cursive script is supposed to be written. This font is also not completely open source, and it's not fully outfitted with scholarly diacritics that, would suit the needs of a major publication. And that's without even mentioning the fact that its rendering of Meroitic characters is kind of inaccurate. And speaking as someone who is semi-literate in Meroitic, some letters are just really hard to recognize compared to their manuscript forms. This font also has no Latin or Arabic component to speak of. Forget Nubian. The next font is Ian James's font, which I haven't really found a way to download. So in terms of our criteria, I can't really assess a lot of it. I think ultimately, though, it'd be nice if this was more accessible, considering that I think it's the most accurate Meroitic font compared to the manuscripts. I think some of the design decisions are still questionable, for reasons I'll get to later, and they don't harmonize gracefully with any Coptic or Latin or Arabic font that I'm really aware of. But again, this is not a font that is widely available, which is kind of a big problem in terms of the accessibility of the Meroitic script. The next Meroitic font is one I discovered completely by accident, Nodo Sans Meroitic, which seems to be the default Meroitic font on Android, which is not a sentence I ever thought I'd say. And it does appear on my phone if you see Meroitic text written on Twitter. From a technical standpoint, it's kind of weird. I want to say it's up to date like the rest of Nodo, but I don't find this font on the actual official Google Nodo websites, which may imply it's outdated. Impressively, it fills out the entire Meroitic Unicode block, including Meroitic numerals. It's more aesthetically pleasing than Aegyptus, but the RK fonts, but it's also pretty severely detached from the Meroitic writing tradition. The letter proportions here are just kind of nonsense. And again, speaking from my semi-literate perspective, a lot of the letters here are almost unrecognizable at a first glance. But thankfully, because it is a Nodo font, it has a harmonious Latin component, a harmonious Arabic component, and a harmonious Coptic component. Not perfect, but it's better than some of the other options. Then last but not least, we have another phantom of a font, which is the new Nubian alphabet, which is not meant for scholarly use of Meroitic, but rather seems to be an attempt to revive the Meroitic script for the purpose of writing modern Nubian languages. From my semi-literate perspective, this is almost unreadable. A lot of the letter forms are clearly based on Meroitic, but don't really follow proper Meroitic ductus, and it's just largely kind of like incomprehensible. That said, I think it looks kind of cool. I mean, the proofs are really extensive, but there's no way to write with this font. If you go to the website where all these proofs are found, the hub, the link to the keyboard that would let you write in the new Nubian alphabet is broken. It's unavailable. So we've kind of lost this really interesting Meroitic revival experiment. But again, it's not really useful for anyone who wants to have an accurate Meroitic font. So despite the number of Meroitic fonts, I haven't been able to locate any writing about the design process, which is odd and unfortunate because Meroitic type design poses a lot of unique challenges. Meroitic, of course, is far older than our modern idea of type design. And when you just look at the manuscripts, it's easy to feel how unintuitive Meroitic type design is at first. A lot of Meroitic texts don't really have a consistent baseline. Actually, a lot of them have line boundaries, which I show in this kind of image here, where the top and bottom of a line are etched into stone, and the letters themselves almost seem in kind of like free variation in terms of their vertical positioning along in this kind of space. The space between the different characters is really, really elastic and inconsistent, and that's the result of the fact that the Kushites didn't use spaces as a way of dividing phrases. They used a colon. So they're really flexible with these things, but of course in modern type design, we usually like to have more consistent / even spaces. In addition to that, there are also a lot of stylistic variations between texts. Some texts favor these like really long descenders, which you can kind of see here, whereas others have these really long descenders be completely flat, parallel to the kind of like baseline, whereas others have some more reasonably proportioned descenders, which would probably be more convenient if you're writing a long-form Meroitic texts. But by far the most interesting challenge Meroitic type design poses is that Meroitic itself is a really unstable and thus diverse script in comparison to something like Nubian. It was used for a really long period of time, and there's just a lot of difference in letter forms as the Meroitic period progresses. That's obviously the case for a lot of scripts, but whereas Latin and Arabic have long type traditions that have kind of created a set of default letter forms for designers, Meroitic hasn't had this, nor has anyone really described their process in picking letter forms, which again is strange because this is the type of thing that deserves a lot of thought. Here I have a graphic showing just how 3 letters morphed over the Meroitic lifespan. I'd kind of argue that they're almost near unrecognizable by the end, and more importantly, they're far harder to distinguish from other letters. To the ancient Kushites, this wasn't a problem because they were fluent in Meroitic and could rely on their own linguistic knowledge to tell whether or not they were looking at a hua or a ma or a sha. But we aren't that cool. So in Sawarda Meroitic, I decided to use letter forms from different time periods to maximize legibility. Whereas in the archaic fonts, or James font, or Nodo, we have hua, ma, and sha look relatively similar, which was the case for most of Meroitic's written history. I used an archaic hua and a late ma to make these 3 types of letters really easily distinct. And I think that unless scholars only want a specific period of Meroitic embodied in their type, that's probably the best solution to make Meroitic easy for a modern reader. Vincent floated to me the idea of providing the user with a lot of options for letter forms, perhaps through an OpenType feature, and while I think this is an excellent idea, it's also beyond the time and effort I'm currently mentally prepared to dedicate to Meroitic. There is one more issue related to Meroitic type, however, which the archaic fonts' kind of unique typing approach is a part of, which is that there are no Meroitic keyboards at all. Not even on Keyman. Without significant workarounds, typing in Meroitic using Meroitic Unicode points is incredibly cumbersome. I hope, alongside Sawarda Meroitic, to develop a keyboard in Keyman and on other operating systems to make writing in Meroitic more accessible. The script is becoming more and more studied, and from a layman's point of view, I think Meroitic still has a lot to offer. This summer, I experimented with translating logos of different video games and brands and music albums into Meroitic, and I realized just how unique this script could be from an aesthetic standpoint. There should be a way for this beauty to be discovered more easily, and it probably starts with making a keyboard so people can actually write in the script. So Sawarda's Meroitic component, to me, is nearing its first solid draft, and I don't expect to make any more major changes to letterform, at least not yet. Once Sawarda is done, hopefully it will have a Nubian component, a Meroitic cursive component, a Meroitic hieroglyphs component, which is a whole other topic, a Latin component, and an Arabic component, leaving no portion of the Nubian and Nubiological communities underserved. But again, this font is still just a start. Prior to Vincent's talk, I was only able to conceive Nubian aesthetically as Sophia or Nodo, and when I wrote in Nubian for the first time, those are the fonts I tried to imitate. Of course, with a slant, which is just not how Nubian is technically supposed to work. Fonts have this powerful ability to shape our imagination when it comes to a script. When I talked about Nubian writing to people, I talked about it as Greek or Coptic with 3 extra letters, because that's what these fonts were subconsciously telling me that Nubian was. But that's underselling Nubian. I understand this is a topic most people in this field don't really care or think about. And I understand, because a year ago, I didn't really care either. I was in the same boat. I was satisfied to write in Nubian, but I think for me and others who want to write in Nubian, it's not just for the sake of having Nubian in writing. We're trying to build on thousands of years of Nubian literacy, and we are trying to rebuild a bridge to our ancestry, which the Nubian script symbolizes. Writing in Nubian and not in Latin or Arabic isn't just a technical decision. It's a personal one, and to a large degree, a political one. And I think Nubian type design should be seen as another way for the inheritors of this written legacy to connect with their heritage and enjoy their identity. And respecting those wishes means taking the Nubian manuscript tradition very seriously, and seriously think about how we can merge the past and the present in our type design. So, in short, I think uniquely Nubian type design matters. If you've been thinking of making your Nubian font, I hope you now have a better idea of the challenges involved. And if you never thought about this topic before, I hope you start to. All right. One sec. Oh, hello, Arbaab. Nice to see you out here. All right. Okay. So, if there are no questions, then I think that's probably all we have for today. We'll definitely be uploading this to the NubiaFest YouTube for the reference of future Nubian type designers. And yeah, I think that is really all there is to it.